Welcome everyone. Welcome to everyone here, and certainly to everyone at home. I know there's a lot of people following us on Facebook and on Zoom, and I want to, first of all, say thank you for everyone who's come here in person. We really appreciate that. We know it's difficult making the transition back to kind of in person, and to remember that we're human beings and that we interact with each other also physically and face to face. So I really appreciate it. I see a lot of my students here, which I'm thrilled. Extra credit for everyone, right? And then just really, so thank you for coming here. I want to just before I invite our dear friend Professor Eric Alterman from the City University of New York, I want to just acknowledge our fellows and our partners for a few minutes, and then we'll begin our event. So just first of all, I want to convey our deepest gratitude to our partners in the American Studies program for co-hosting this event with us, to the program's director, Dr. Yael Sternhell, who is also a member of our Center Steering Committee and who we will hear from soon, and to Dr. Nir Evron, the head of the English department. Second, I want to thank our Center Steering Committee for their support and hard work over the year. First and foremost, Professor Milet Shamir, the Vice President of Tel Aviv University, who's also our greatest supporter here at Tau, as well as to Professors Michael Zakim, Roy Kreitner, Udi Zomer, and Elad Segev. Thirdly, I want to thank the center staff, which is really the engine for all of these events and activities. All of them, very talented young scholars of the United States in their own right. Or Asher, Hadar Dreiman, and Yossi Edri, and thank you for all of your hard work over the year. It's very much appreciated. And finally, I want to thank our partners at the Fulbright program and the American Embassy in Israel, especially Dr. Anat Lapidot and Dr. Eitan Schiffman, who are our partners in every sense of the word. And we are certainly grateful for that. They help us make all of these events possible. All right, now I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge our wonderful graduate student fellows this year and to celebrate their pioneering research. We are very proud to help cultivate the burgeoning community of Americanists in Israel and to support the next generation of scholars who study the United States in all Israeli universities, not just in Tau. And as you can tell from the remarkably fresh, diverse, topical, and interdisciplinary scholarship, we have much to look forward to in the future. So I would like just to welcome, one by one, our fellows this year to receive their fellowship award. And they really are, they're the heart of our pedagogical and research activities, and we are very proud of them, and we just want the opportunity to show off, really. So very briefly, I want to invite our fellows this year to come and get the award formally. This is by alphabetical order. First, Uri Appenzeller from the University of Haifa's History Department. The title of his doctoral dissertation is, in Hebrew, מאמריקה תחילה אל מציון תצא תורה, שורשי השמרנות הפוליטית היהודית במחצית השנייה של המאה ה-20. אורי, תודה רבה. Second, Or Asher, Tel Aviv University Political Science Department, and the title of his doctoral dissertation is The Israeli Conservative Movement, American Money, American Ideas. A lot of Israelis are studying American conservatism, right? And that already tells you what's happening here. In Bar, is in Bar here? All right, so we'll wait with that. I don't see Bar here. Roy Choresh, Tel Aviv University Political Science Department. The title of his doctoral dissertation, States Don't Always Balance, the Power of Unprovocative IR. Next, Hadass Lorber, also from Tel Aviv University's Political Science Department. The title of her doctoral dissertation, The U.S. Congress and the Intelligence Community, Why is Oversight Ineffective? Shiran, is Shiran? Shiran Lipatz, from Tel Aviv University's Labor Studies Department. It is all about the money, non-pecuniary returns to higher education in the labor market. Okay, Shiran's not here. Yitzhak Mor, from Hebrew University, the Religious Studies Department, and the title of his doctoral dissertation in Hebrew as well, בין תיאולוגיה לפוליטיקה, יהודים ונוצרים בימין הדתי החדש בארצות הברית. מזל טוב. Anat Ovadia Rosner from Tel Aviv University's law school. And the title of her project is Class, Gender, and Racial Segregation in the American South, the Role of Individual Lawsuits in the Struggle for Equality, 1865 to 1920. And Chen Peretz from the University of Haifa's History Department. The title of his doctoral dissertation is The Political Utilization of Inflation, Stagflation, Financialization, and the Ford Administration's Attempt to Advance a Neoliberal Agenda. Right, Chen is not here. Jonathan Unger from Tel Aviv University's Film Studies. And the title of his project in Hebrew is Avudim, Hanotarim, Vehashomrim, Philosophia Takiyum Shel HaYekum הלינדולפיאני. אני לא הבנתי את זה, אבל... הוא מבין, זה מה שחשוב. And just some of our additional fellows who aren't here, but I'd like to acknowledge their accomplishments. Itamar Lifshitz from Tel Aviv University's History Department, Batel Levi from Tel Aviv University's History Department, Ala Chaj Yachia from Tel Aviv University's Law School, Ran Itzkovich from Hebrew University's Sociology Department, Yair Aviv from the University of Haifa History Department, and Noah Toiv from the University of Haifa History Department as well. Thank you all, and good luck to you. Okay, and now to our main event. I am honored to invite Professor Eric Alterman to give his main talk today about the American left in Israel. Professor Alterman is a CUNY Distinguished Professor of English at Brooklyn College, a contributing writer to The Nation and the American Prospect, among other places. He is the author of 11 previous titles, including the New York Times bestseller, What Liberal Media? The Truth About Bias and the News. His most recent book was Lying in State, Why Presidents Lie and Why Trump is Worse. My favorite book of his, and what I think is the best history to date of post-war American liberalism, is The Cause, The Fight for American Liberalism from Franklin Roosevelt to Barack Obama. And his forthcoming book, which is also the topic of today's talk, is We Are Not One, A History of America's Fight Over Israel. So I'd like to invite Professor Alterman to briefly introduce his book now, and then Dr. Sternhell will engage him in an open conversation about the American left in Israel. Just one request, just please hold questions and comments to the end. We'll have a Q&A, so everyone can, hopefully it's not angry comments, but if they are angry, let's just wait until the end.
Angry comments are okay.
Yeah.
They're expressed politely and appropriately.
Right, all right, so let's welcome Professor Alterman.
Thank you. It's a thrill to see so many people in person. Everybody hear me all right? Yeah. So actually, my talk, I took some notes. I usually try and talk without any notes because it impresses people, but I flew all the way here and I made some notes, although I made notes on this topic, the American left in Israel, so I'm just going to focus on that, but I'm happy to talk about anything during the Q&A. I don't want to take too much time speaking personally. I just want to say before I start that one reason I'm generally critical of identity politics is that I think all of us have multiple identities and we privilege different ones at different times. So speaking personally, I'm here, I think, operating under maybe 4 identities. One is I'm a historian, and that's the one I intend to spend most of my time as. But I can't ignore the fact that I've been a political columnist, a media columnist for 27 years, and I've written many, many, many articles about media coverage of the conflict and US policy towards the conflict. And I'm also an American Jew, and there's that, or whatever that's worth. And finally, I'm a former student of Tel Aviv University. I spent a semester here in 1980, 42 years ago. I had a great faculty. I had the honor and pleasure of studying with Shimon Shamir, with Itamar Rabinovich, with Arnon Gutfeld, who I was very fortunate to become close friends with at the time. And it was 1980, so Shimon Shamir organized what may be the only Egyptian-Israeli conference. I still have the little book that was published, if you need it, about self-image of both sides. I took one of the first Egged buses, my friends and I, to Cairo from Tel Aviv, and we almost caused quite a few international incidents that are left unsaid about that. But my point is that actually I'm a great fan of Yael's dad, and I went to visit him and his wife on a reporting trip, your mother, and I asked him a question that I've always wanted the answer to, which is, did labor really start the settlements? And he said to me something I quote to people all the time. I didn't get a chance to tell you this. He said to me, you know, I never could get a good answer to that question from my friends, meaning the prime minister and foreign minister. So I decided to write a book about it. And I've always admired that answer, and I feel like that I've been writing books where I want the answer. And in some ways, this is my 12th book. In some ways, I guess I'm writing my autobiography. All of my books are sort of about parts of me that I won't explain to myself. But anyway, I left Tel Aviv University. I went back to my home university, Cornell, where I was followed by Shimon Shamir, Itamar Rabinovich, and Chaim Shaked, I believe. And I began my senior honors thesis on the topic of the Six-Day War and the origins of Jewish neoconservatism. And then 10 years later, I started my doctoral thesis on the founding. Is this all right? Got a problem?
Just lift it a bit so they could take it home.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, people at home. And then 10 years later, when I was doing my doctoral work, I thought I was going to write a thesis on the founding of the State of Israel and its effect on American liberalism. And I spent a year researching that. And I mentioned these two things, first of all, because I'm sure studying here at Tel Aviv sent me in that direction. But second of all, because I'm such a nerd, I saved my notes from both places. I have 40-year-old notes and 30-year-old notes that are in my new book from interviews I did back then. So anyway, now to get to my topic, which, again, I took notes for the history of the American left, and rather than the whole thing, but we can talk about the whole thing. And if I had a subtitle, are we still got an issue here? Where do you want it? Here?
Yeah.
All right.
Sorry.
Okay. Again, sorry everybody at home. So if I had a subtitle for my talk, and Yael, please stop me whenever you need to stop me. It would be How Israel Lost the Left. And to me, there's no question Israel lost the left. Now, a better question would be, and one I want you to think about, is how much does it matter that Israel lost the left? In what ways does it matter? Because in some ways, it doesn't matter at all. But for instance, I begin with a quote, somewhat out of context, but I think it's still true, that Nancy Pelosi said in 1985, and she wouldn't disavow this today, and most people in America would say Nancy Pelosi is on the left. Nancy Pelosi said, if the Capitol ever crumbled to the ground, the one thing that would remain would be our commitment to Israel. And I think that's fair. So as far as American politics goes, like congressional politics, presidential politics, it's a different story than the story that I'm going to try and tell very quickly about Israel and the American left. Okay, now, for the longest time, and I'd say from the beginnings of Zionism, even before Herzl, Zionism was a Christian movement in the United States and not a Jewish movement. The first Jews to come to America in mid-19th century were German Jews. They were almost all Reform Jews, and they were intensely anti-Zionist. They thought that Jews were not a people, it was a religion, just like Christianity was, and they did not want their fellow Americans questioning their patriotism or their commitment to the United States. And they, over and over, the leaders of German Jewish Reform journalism condemned and rejected Zionism, and over and over said, America is our Zion. And then they were overwhelmed in from the beginning in the 1880s through the 1920s by the Eastern European Jews who came over, escaping the violent anti-Semitism in the Pale Settlement at the time. And there were about 2 million of these Eastern European Jews and only about 250,000 of the German Jews. And the Eastern European Jews, who were poor and unskilled and socialist for the main part, although many remained religious, they were pro-Zionist because they felt that Jews needed a place to go. And they had family members who were trying to get out of the Pale, and they had some that went to Palestine. And they also experienced Judaism much more as a people than as a religion. The Lower East Side of New York, if I'm not mistaken, was the most crowded place in the history of the earth at the time. And so there was this conflict between the German Jews and Eastern European Jews over Zionism. And it was solved by Louis Brandeis, the first Jewish Supreme Court justice, who became, for complicated reasons, the head of the Zionist Organization of America in the 1920s. And he solved it in the same way that it's solved today if you call yourself a Zionist in America, which he says, yes, we're for Zionism, just for other people. We're fine where we are. We don't need a homeland. We've got our homeland. But a lot of people do. So we're going to be good Americans by being good Zionists. And this worked. And so the Zionist organizations grew into large organizations. And it became, over time, the religion, actually, of American Jews. The 1940s, obviously, the crisis contributed to an intense debate. And at that point, the American Jewish Committee was still very uncomfortable with Zionism. And they had all the mockers in their group and all the money. But they, again, were overwhelmed by the masses. And the American Jews became very pro-Zionist, having a great deal to do with how helpless they felt in the face of the Holocaust. And also, you know, there's an argument between historians over could more have been done to save Jews rather than support the Zionists. And I can't solve that argument. There's arguments on either side. But there's no question that one of them was about the future and about hope and about strength, and the other one was about shame and sadness and so forth. And so it was a sort of easy victory to say that we're solving the crisis of Jewish history with Zionism. And it was really a fantastic thing. I mean, of course, I need to tell you the story of Israel, but the story of American Zionism and the campaign on behalf of, to get Truman to recognize the state of Israel and to support it, it's the greatest lobbying campaign in all of human history, as far as I can tell. I mean, there are a number of municipalities in New York, in the country, that sent more postcards and more letters, far more postcards and more letters than they had people. I mean, I kind of, one of the many reasons I feel sorry for the Palestinians is they don't have anything like what the Zionists had when they were trying to create a state in terms of lobbying, energy, and organization, and of course finances. Now, Israel was by and large a leftist cause at its founding. In the first place, the Soviet Union supported the founding of the state of Israel. But the main issue for the left at the end of World War II was imperialism versus anti-imperialism. And so the question is who are the imperialists and who are the anti-imperialists in Palestine? And the Zionists won that fight hands down because first of all, the Palestinians had the problem of the Mufti supporting the Nazis. And yet the Arabs were seen as backward in the past, and the Zionists were socialist, and they were building something very exciting, and the American Jews cared very deeply about it. So if you look at the arguments in those days, the American Jewish Committee was a little nervous. The New York Times was very anti-Zionist. The State Department was very anti-Zionist. But the left was very much united. The New Republic under Henry Wallace, who edited it for a brief time, the vice president who then ran as a third-party candidate with communist support, was very pro-Israel. When he visited here, he loved the place. The Nation magazine, where I worked for 25 years, people are shocked to hear about its intense commitment to the Zionist project. I had the good fortune to in my 20s, to become close friends with I.F. Stone, who was a famous left-wing journalist who worked for The Nation, he worked for PM, he wrote for the New Republic. He wrote a famous book called Underground to Palestine, where he traveled with one of the refugee boats and snuck into Palestine, and then wrote a big bestseller. As an aside, he was offered $50,000 in 1946 money to take out his call for binationalism, and he wouldn't do it. So if you look at the breakdown at the time of the founding of the state, there was the, inside Palestine was Judah Magnus and the Ehud movement, featuring intellectuals like Magnus and Martin Buber and Henrietta Zoll and Gershom Scholem. And their position was there should be no state in Israel until the Arabs agreed to join us in creating something. But of course, there were no Arabs who were interested in that. And the only people who liked Ehud in the United States were fellow intellectuals. Albert Einstein did, my friend Izzy Stone did, Hannah Arendt did. Incredibly ironically, the founding editors of Commentary magazine did. And the State Department, and the New York Times. The New York Times correspondent in Palestine was an Ehud member. And the State Department was bringing Magnus over to try and convince the Congress not to fund, not to support, not to give any support at all to the Yishuv after the state was even declared. It was crazy how long they stuck to this notion that Israel could be prevented. Anyway, the left, with the exception of those Ehud supporters who were a particular kind of Zionist, was almost 100% Zionist. That situation seemed to hold until about 1967. I'm papering over some things, but by and large, everybody loved Israel in America until 1967. And it was kind of like a Disneyland for American Jews. They thrilled to it. They didn't want to come here. Only, I think, 6,000 American Jews made Aliyah after the state was founded out of about 5 million. So it's an insignificant number. In fact, I found a cable from an Israeli diplomat in Washington saying, you don't bring up making Aliyah any more than you bring up a bride's virginity, in public. It's just not something that you talk about in public because it's considered impolite. I guess I meant a bride's lack of virginity. So in '67, two things happened. One is that the American Jewish community became transformed really overnight into the community it has looked like for a very long time, until recently, a community where Israel became the religion of American Jews. What my friend Shaul Magid calls the Zionization of American Jewishness. And all these organizations, the Jewish organizations, first of all, their budgets quadrupled overnight. And second of all, the budgets went to support Israel. So they dropped their educational budgets, they dropped their Tikkun Olim budgets, and they became pro-Israel organizations. And synagogues had Israeli flags and sang Hatikvah. And one of the arguments in my book is that the Zionization of American Jewry has crowded out the Judaism, the Jewish component. And now that it doesn't work out so well anymore, there's that crisis to deal with. And the second thing that happened was that the left, the far left, which we used to have in America, turned very much against Israel and saw Israel as part of the imperialist colonialist camp. And these were, back then, there was a very large black liberation movement, a very large student movement, a very large leftist movement that was inspired by Vietnam and Black Power, and they saw the Palestinians as part of the revolutionary vanguard that the Vietnamese were also part of, that all the Algerians were part of, that all revolutionary movements were part of, and they embraced the Palestinians. And one byproduct of that, which I never have time to do justice to, but is that black politicians in America have by and large remained pro-Palestinian in a way that very few white politicians have been until recently. So there's been this disconnect. If you want to talk later about there was an affair with Andy Young, President Carter's representative to the United Nations was forced to resign for a meeting with the PLO under complicated circumstances. And this led to an enormous fight between blacks and Jews that had been brewing for a long time in the United States. But it grew out of this moment where the black leadership had begun to embrace the Palestinian cause in a way that really no mainstream white politicians had done. So now liberals, American liberals were in a funny position in the 1970s because they thought that Vietnam was a disaster. They thought that Nixon was a disaster. They thought Lyndon Johnson was a disaster. They thought that we shouldn't be fighting any more wars, but they were committed to defending Israel. So the conservatives said, this is part of the birth of neoconservatism. The conservatives said, well, you know, it's nice that you liberals have made this one exception for Israel. But they would say to American Jews, how can you depend on these people? They can't explain why this one case is different than every other case. When George McGovern gave his Come Home America address to the Democratic Convention, he then turned around and said, except for Israel. He did. I can read you the quotes, but I'm trying to go fast. He said, Israel should not give up 1 square foot of ground until they have a commitment from the Arab nations to respect their borders. And this position is now mocked by people on the left as with the initials PEP, progressive except for Palestine. But it was the position of almost all mainstream liberals for quite a long time. And the Israelis and their supporters in AIPAC and elsewhere would exploit this because Israel would always get like 4 votes in the UN, you know, for whatever it was doing. And the Israelis would repay countries like El Salvador and Guatemala and later South Africa with getting support for them in Congress from liberals. And AIPAC would demand it, and liberals would go along with it because the Israelis were so good at expanding their what it meant to be pro-Israel. I mean, most Americans are more pro-Israel than any other liberal democracy, according to, but they're not so pro-Israel that they would say, for instance, Israel should be the only country in the world whose military does not account for how its military aid is used. But it is. And that's written into legislation in Congress. So there was this really, AIPAC for the longest time, and its allies, were able to achieve a few things that no other lobby was able to achieve. One is to get legislation written that had nothing to do with their issues, but was helpful to Israel in its diplomatic engagement. The second thing AIPAC did was police the discussion so that anyone who was critical of Israel in a way that was not acceptable at the moment was written out as anti-Semitic or self-hating. And it's changed over time. So like for a while, saying the word Palestinian was not kosher. And then saying homeland. Jimmy Carter got in a lot of trouble for saying homeland. Interestingly, he got in trouble from I have trouble with my memory. The rabbi historian president of the American Jewish Congress, Arthur Hertzberg. Yeah. He was always attacking Jimmy Carter for saying the wrong thing, and all he was saying was these people deserve, you know, to live in peace and dignity. So in the 1980s, I'm jumping ahead, and I hope you'll ask me questions about what I have to skip. In the 1980s, you had 3 things that came together that sort of ran things, I would say, I don't know, for the next 20, 30 years. One was the birth of neoconservatism, or the flowering of neoconservatism. One was AIPAC's, when AIPAC lost the AWACS fight, it decided to become a grassroots organization that would not only lobby congressmen, but it would people their staffs. It would people the staff at the Pentagon. It would have grassroots organizations in every major city, many of which had few Jews in them, and it would recruit congressmen to run for seats, and it would see that they got their funding, early funding. So it became kind of stupid to oppose AIPAC because it meant you would have an opponent, and really, what did you care about the issue in the first place? If you were from Minnesota or South Dakota or whatever. And they would defeat people every once in a while to show who was boss. You know, they defeated the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And the third thing they did was police the discourse so that if you took a bad position in the media, you had a lot of source. And again, who needs that? So for the longest time, if you wanted an op-ed supporting the Palestinians, you either had to go to Noam Chomsky or Edward Said, because they could take it. And who happened to be, by the way, the two most famous intellectuals possibly in the world. But it was very hard to find anyone who could take a pro-Palestinian position in the American media for a very long time. Now, what happened? Well, the first thing that happened was the Lebanon War. That was the first time that American Jewish dissidents got any traction in criticizing Israel. They said, this has gone too far. We don't like this. And it was also the first time, you know, a lot of the American correspondents were based in Beirut. And when Israel was bombing Beirut, a city, they were horrified. They didn't understand it. And Sharon was always very unpopular. I guess I should say another important thing that happened was Begin being elected, because he was not the kind of Jew that American Jews admire. So the Exodus version of Israel ceased to be credible beginning in 1982 in public. And I should mention there was one group of rabbis called Brei Ra in the 70s, late 70s, that tried to take on the establishment, the American Jewish establishment in Israel. And they failed because they met with the PLO at a time when that was completely unkosher. Two of them did. One of them was a rabbi named Max Tickton, who I mentioned because he was head of Hillel. He was one of the heads of the Hillel organization. And I mentioned Max just because I became like a Jew. Like Hebrew school ruined me for Judaism, but Max brought me back. So the fact that I've been studying Judaism in a relatively serious way, I owe to that man. The second interesting thing about Brei Ra is that it was started by a man named Rabbi Arnold Wolf, who was a rabbi in Highland Park, Chicago. And in the 1990s, a black couple moved across the street, bought a condo, and became friends with Rabbi Wolf. And that black couple, one of them became president of the United States, and the other one became first lady of the United States. And they stayed close. And so Barack Obama's political education on Israel and Palestine was given to him by the founder of this dissident left-wing rabbis group, and that's how Barack came to understand the issue. So 82, you get the sort of the first break in the omerta rule of American Jews. Nobody ever criticizes Israel in public. That began. 88, with the first Intifada, the dam pretty much broke. When Rabin said we need to break their bones, that really struck a terrible chord among American Jews. And they would interview, the media would interview the Palestinian teenagers in the hospital with their legs up in the air, you know. And the second thing that happened in 1988 was the emergence of Palestinian spokespeople, particularly on American television, who were not Yasser Arafat, who were Mr. Eroc and Hanan Shrawi, yes. There was a famous Nightline episode, a week of Nightline actually, done, I was here then actually, done from Jerusalem. And PBS, I don't think this ever happened before, PBS re-showed the Nightline later all week because it was such an important thing. So the humanization of the Palestinians began with the first Intifada. And liberals, it became harder and harder to defend Israel. Now, a lot happened. Oslo happened. With Oslo, the right wing started attacking the Israeli government. And Mr. Rabinovich, the ambassador, was dodging tomatoes when he would speak in the United States. And of course, Oslo failed. And the media remained largely in the Israelis' camp. Not entirely, but largely. And then over time, this began to change, in part because on college campuses, and I'm not doing justice to anything I'm saying really, but in college campuses, the switch had flipped. Edward Said's Orientalism became probably the most assigned book of all time. It's been reprinted in 36 languages, including Hebrew. And it became foundational. There's a lot of problems with that book from the standpoint of people who are in the fields that he covers, but it's an incredibly polymathic achievement, and it had an enormous effect on all of the humanities as it was being taught in the 1980s and 90s. And the second thing you have to understand is that when the left collapsed in the United States, it collapsed into the universities. So my late friend Todd Gitlin, coined the phrase, they took over the government and we took over the English department. And it's true. So the elite universities in America were peopled by people who saw themselves as continuing their revolutionary struggle to some degree by adopting the terms that Said had laid out in Orientalism, which, again, I'm not doing justice to this, but Orientalism is the precursor to intersectionality, which is the basis of the BDS movement, which is now, I would say, mainstream thought in most elite universities. It's not really challenged very much. So the universities and then the liberal publications all began to turn partially out of sympathy for the Palestinians, the fact that the occupation seemed to be going on and on and on and on, and partially because of the transformation of Israel, which I don't need to tell you, has elected right-wing government after right-wing government, where following the Second Intifada, there was a collapse of the peace movement, and the American Jewish community got great strength from Shalom Akshav. I'm skipping around a little bit, but they got great strength from people like Yeshuvat Hakarbi, and Amos Oz, and Aleph Bet Yeshua, and Amos Alon, and Yehuda Amakai, writing up. Those four guys wrote an op-ed in '88 saying, stop supporting our terrible government. And that made it okay. But that collapsed too. So the only place to go was towards a rhetorical battle on behalf of the Palestinians. And this is the point. Is it okay, like two or three more minutes and I'm good? Yeah. So here's where I want to leave you with, but I'm leaving you in a place where I'm inviting many questions. So if you look at the history of Israel and the left, in the American left in the United States, Israel has lost the left. I was the last person at the Nation. I left 2 years ago. I was there for 25 years. I was the last person who would ever defend Israel in any circumstances at the Nation. Jacobin magazine will never defend Israel. The New Republic, the diehard defender of Israel, no matter what, under Marty Peretz, is now pro-Palestinian. The New York Review of Books is pro-Palestinian. All elite universities, the Harvard Crimson endorsing BDS is not anything exceptional about that, except that people paid attention to it. The Middle East Studies endorsing BDS is also not surprising. I wrote an op-ed in the Times a couple of years ago about BDS. They asked me for it, but my daughter was at the University of Wisconsin at the time, and she called me up during Israel Apartheid Week and said, Dad, if Israel is committing crimes against humanity, why are we not supporting BDS? And And the reason it is because BDS doesn't actually do anything for the Palestinians except make them maybe feel better that they haven't been forgotten entirely. But I don't like it because I believe in free speech and free expression. But I also don't like it because it's counterproductive in many ways. First of all, it's given American politicians and Israeli politicians an excuse to shut down freedom of discourse. Second of all, boycotting Jews is a bad idea for historical reasons. You know, like they don't respond well to it. They don't give you what you want when you boycott them. But third of all, telling the people, I'm guessing, most of the people in this room, and Israeli filmmakers and artists and musicians, not to come to America and speak to university students is crazy. Because the fact is the only way there can be peace and dignity for the Palestinians because of the power relationship between the two, this is the way of the world, is if Israel decides it's okay. Because Israel can prevent it, and it has prevented it, and it's continuing to prevent it. In the last 4 elections, there wasn't even any discussion of it, by and large. And BDS is counterproductive in all of those ways. So it's counterproductive with regard to freedom of speech, and it's counterproductive politically. And it's been around since 2005. Not one university, not one major labor union, not one local government in the United States has endorsed it. My union, I'm a member of the union at CUNY, they're voting on it soon, and I said, well, why are we doing this? We're going to get a lot of people angry. The Palestinians may hear about it, but probably won't, and we're going to destroy part of our union over it, and it's not going to help anyone. Why don't we raise money and send books to the library in Gaza? They need books. The bookstore was destroyed. Anyway, so the battle, my point is that, and again, I'm going backwards and forwards at the same time. Almost from the beginning, the discussion of Israel and later the discussion of Israel-Palestine in the United States has spun on its own wheels. It has responded to its own impeti. I believe that's the plural of impetus. It has had a relationship to what's actually happening here, where we are, but a very distant one. Until recently, it was impossible to admit that most of the Palestinians were expelled, that they didn't leave voluntarily. Now it's admitted, now it's debated, but you know, sorry, there's nothing to be done about it. And I'm not taking a position. I'm not speaking now at all. I'm not taking a position on anything between Israel and the Palestinians. I can, but it doesn't matter. Who cares what I think? It's not going to change anything. What I'm telling you is to explain how the discourse in the United States works. So Israel has lost the left. It's lost the left-wing media. It's lost left-wing columnists who have a media platform. It's lost all the social media that is involved in politics. It's the darling of the extreme right. It's Jared Kushner. It's these horrible people, even worse, believe it or not, than Jared Kushner and Donald Trump, et cetera. Maybe not worse than Trump, but all those people. It's foundational for the Republican Party that is attempting to destroy democracy. AIPAC has joined in that effort recently by endorsing and giving money to people who are insurrectionists and refusing to cooperate with the January 6th committee. The Christian right, it's again foundational. When the Moral Majority was founded, it had a plank about Israel, and now CUFI, Citizens United for Israel, or Christians United for Israel, I'm sorry, is the largest pro-Israel group in the entire world with 6 million members. So the lines are very clearly drawn. And you know, Israel has a Hasbara program, and all of these groups are attempting to reach out to American liberals, but they have nothing to reach out to them with anymore. Because the argument that I was given that made sense to me when I was growing up, and maybe it made sense to my daughter, that there was a Holocaust, and these Jews have never been safe, and the Israelis were invaded and are at risk at every minute, that argument just doesn't hold water anymore. And so American Jews who have they're still being given this exact argument by American Jewish organizations and by their parents and grandparents. They're learning something very different at college. Most American Jews go to college. They're learning something very different in college. They're seeing something very, very different on the news. For the first time, this is very important, for the first time you can actually get good information from Israel-Palestine if you want it. It's all available on social media and on the internet and Haaretz every day. So what they see, they don't like. You can say, okay, we're nicer to gay people than anybody else in the region. They have an answer for that. The reason I wrote this book, like there's this argument about pinkwashing, which I don't want to get into. But the reason I wrote this book, it's 530 pages, is because I've always found it impossible to discuss Israel with other Americans without people just getting angry at each other. Because it's an issue of identity. And no matter what you say, the answer is a whataboutist answer. Yes, well, that may be true, but what about this? You never, ever change anybody's mind. And the only people's minds I've ever changed are my parents, and that took 30 years.
Well, some people can't even claim that.
And also, everything's really complicated. Like, I could probably argue the opposite of what I've been saying if I needed to, if someone were paying me enough money. So I wrote a book to lay out just how the complexities of this situation, and to demonstrate how little the American debate has to do with the reality on the ground. Now, my final statement is, okay, so Israel has lost the left. No question about it. And it can't get it back as long as it has this occupation, and even your good government had 72 votes on the right and is building 4,000 new settlements and doing terrible things every day. What does it matter? And I have to say, I'm not sure what it matters, at least to Israel. There were 9 votes against a $1 billion Iron Dome system out of 434, and $1 billion on top of the $38 billion that Barack Obama signed into his memo of understanding. And by the way, the Israelis hate Barack Obama. American Jews love Barack Obama. The book is called We Are Not One because, for 2 reasons. One is because there's a complete disjunction between the debate in Israel, about Israel, and what's actually happening in Israel. But also because the 2 people are not one. 80% of Israelis like Trump and didn't like Obama. The opposite is true of American Jews. American Jewish rabbinate is turning pro-Palestinian. The rabbinical students and the cantoral students are turning pro-Palestinian. American Jewish youth are walking away from Judaism. And so they're either turning away from Israel, by and large, or they're walking away from Judaism entirely. Because Judaism has no answers for them, because the answer they get is pro-Israel, watch out for anti-Semitism. There's no content. This is not true for the Orthodox, and the Orthodox are flourishing, and that's another thing we can talk about. But secular American Judaism is dying on the vine because it's been replaced by nothing but pro-Israelism, and pro-Israelism doesn't work anymore. Now, it's really bad news for American Jews, and the conclusion of my book is we need to rejuvenate American Jewish institutions, educational institutions, tikkun olam institutions, etc. That the $50 billion raised for birthright, some of that money should have gone to schools so that people could have the experience that I've had since I met Max Tickton and learned all about the wonders of Jewish history and Jewish culture. But the other part of that argument is I'm not sure that's going to change anything with regard to the American politics, because the powers that be are so entrenched and the Republican Party is so dedicated to its position on Israel, and Democrats are so afraid of taking on this monster that will come down on them if they step over the line, that there's no value in it. So as far as I can tell, and again, I can't see anything happening good with the occupation. So So I just see the lines getting nastier and nastier, more and more arguments over words like apartheid, but very little systematic or institutional change in the way the American government operates vis-a-vis Israel. And therefore, finally, the last thing I would say is if it came to this, I think Israel wouldn't care what American government said. If Israel didn't want to do what America didn't want to do, it wouldn't do it. As Benjamin Netanyahu said when he didn't know he was being filmed, the American people are very easily moved. And what I think he meant is that Israelis have a lot more patience than Americans. So if there's a conflict, over time the Americans will forget about it and the Israelis will eventually get what they want. And I think if you look at the history of every time there's been a public conflict, that's what's happened. So if I were an Israeli and I were worried that the American left has turned against Israel and this was going to be a problem for Israel, well, it's a problem for Israel's reputation. It's a problem for your friends, maybe your relatives' children, and they're worried about what they're hearing, and it's a lot of source. But there isn't, I don't see any fundamental change happening. I just see the argument getting uglier and uglier. So that's my
I think this is a good point to
optimistic
start,
message
because
for the rest of you.
it's 7 and we'd like to
Oh, I'm
listen to
sorry.
questions.
I'm
No,
sorry.
that was extremely interesting, and
Thank you.
I think taught all of us things that we did not know, even those of us who are deeply involved and interested in this. I mean, I will say, just as a footnote, that do you want to say?
Yeah, I
How
do.
do you want to do this? Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. That, you know, when you say Israelis, then I would like to resist that definition, because a lot of the people in this room, including myself, are Israeli. We live here, we pay taxes, we send our children to the army, but we actively resist everything that this government does. So in the same way that Trump and his administration didn't represent all Americans, then this government does not represent all of us. And there is still an active and combative Israeli left. It may be small, but it is doing the work on the ground, and that I think needs to be acknowledged. Okay, so this is actually where your final statement is exactly where I wanted to start the conversation. There seems to be quite an inexplicable disjuncture, and I don't know if you can explain it or if anyone can explain it, between the process of transformation in public opinion that you have just laid out, and the fact that American Jews have changed their minds, that large portions of American progressives have changed their minds, and yet we see no change in American policy. Barack Obama may have been educated on the conflict by a dissident rabbi, but what did it matter, really? He did so little here. He was 8 years in power, and there was barely any impact on the situation on the ground. So is it the foreign policy establishment? Is it the national security establishment? Are these sort of just hard, cold American interests? They need Israel for their sort of larger global security apparatus that's driving this uncritical support of Israel? That's my first question. And another footnote, because, you know, I have a microphone and I can't help myself, so what the hell?
And I went on too long.
No, do not, please. I just know there will be many questions, and I wanted to make sure we have time for them. I don't think Israelis are patient. I think Israelis are spoiled, and Israelis have gotten used to the good life, and Israelis absolutely need American support. And that getting the Israeli public to reckon with the geopolitical reality that it has created here might be easier than one could think, considering the fact that, you know, this is not North Korea here. People want to go to restaurants in the evening. And I think that that needs to be taken into account, that if America would have liked to make a real impact here, I think it could have. You have the mic.
Yeah. You can still hear me? Yeah? Yeah. No? For the room, I think I need the mic. Thanks.
Do you want to take this one?
Well, I need this note for the. I need that for them. Take it off. I'm going to defer to you on point 2 because I don't pretend to be an expert on the Israeli public. I just look at the election results really, and I read how hard it's. On your first point, in Barack Obama's presidential memoir, he quotes his aide Ben Rhodes in the beginning of his term. And Ben Rhodes just came back from seeing a congressman saying he's very worried about you calling for a freeze on settlement building, which Obama did at the beginning of his term. And Obama said, wait, this guy is opposed to settlements and opposed to the idea. And Ben Rhodes, deputy national security advisor, said yes, but he's more opposed to doing anything about it. And that became Obama's position. Obama, he came in and he went to Egypt, and everybody agrees he made a strategic mistake by not stopping off in Israel, and the Israelis never felt comfortable with him until he came here and spoke and showed you what an incredible politician he was. But by then it was too late. I don't know if it's Israel or if it's Israel supporters in the United States, but there have been 3 presidents, I would say, who've done the most for Israel in terms of its security. The first was Harry Truman, by recognizing the state.
Maybe speak a bit farther.
By recognizing the state a few minutes after it was declared. The second was Jimmy Carter, who froze the Egyptian war and made Israel more secure than it had ever been before, and it remains secure as a result. It never having to worry about having to fight a full-fledged war, and allows Israel to carry out military operations wherever it wants to, really, without having to worry about going to war with Egypt. And the third was Barack Obama, who, number one, told Israelis the truth. You can't do this indefinitely. I believe he said the words, if not now, when, and if not you, whom, to the Israelis. I think he said it through Jeffrey Goldberg. And then signed that memo of understanding for $38 billion over, I guess, 10 years. So leaving aside Harry Truman, no 2 presidents have been as reviled and disliked by the Israelis and by the American Jewish establishment as Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama, with maybe the exception of the first George Bush, who also, he was rather tough on this one, but who eventually gave in. So the answer to your first question is America is not a democracy. We have elections every 4 years, but in between those elections, the issues are determined by the interests that are willing to fight over them in the places where power is manifested. And in those places, another thing Ben Rhodes said in his memoir is that more than anything, he wanted some pressure from the left on Israel, and he never got it. All the pressure came from the left. There's never any counterweight. J Street was founded for that reason. And it's like, I don't want to criticize J Street. They've got a hard job, and they're not doing badly, but there's no pro-Palestinian lobby at all. There are a few small lobbies on behalf of Arab Americans, but there's no congressional lobby that is about Palestinians. And again, if you want to cause a lot of trouble for yourself as a congressman or a senator or even a congressional staffer, oppose Israel in a public way. And why would you want to do that? I mean, I have friends on other issues who are congressmen, and they want to take an unpopular position on something. And I would tell them, why do you want to do this? You can do so much good, and you can't win this one. Why do you want to commit suicide and not be able to do the good that you do? Plus, it's their job. How they make their living. So AIPAC has been so effective in creating this atmosphere that there's just nothing useful about opposing Israel, and an awful lot to be lost. And there are 2 reasons why I spend a lot of time in the book on the campus issues that make them interesting and important. One is the source that American Jewish parents feel when their children come home from and they say Israel is apartheid and terrible and they hate it. And they don't like to do it. Why am I paying $50,000 a year for that? The second reason is that these colleges are training the future secretaries of state and national security advisors and support. When I was younger, I was close friends with Tony Wont. This one turned out to be not a million, but a lot. And Tony is part of the old generation as far as Israel. But this new generation of young people, where the norm is to talk about Israel as a settler colonial state, where the word apartheid is accepted more and more, that over time, when you say it's at the establishment, well, the establishment is changing, and that is where the change might come from. But the lobbying of people like AOC, the squad, they're not going to be able to change anything because the interest of everyone except Brooklyn, San Francisco, maybe Ann Arbor. Everyone else is going to say, "What do I need this source?" The person who just won, do you remember her name, Laura? Do you remember the name of the woman who won the primary just now? No, where the AIPAC spent millions of dollars and lost in last week in a primary.
Is it the Pittsburgh one?
I guess. Yeah, Pittsburgh. Okay, so that was an enormous effort. And the person who took the pro-Israel position got $6 million, I think I'm quoting that figure accurately. The money Israel wasn't even discussed on the money that AIPAC spent. Now, are you gonna say it would be a good idea for me to invite millions and millions of dollars to be spent on my opponent, even to recruit an opponent, to defeat me on an issue that is not of primary concern to almost anyone in my district? And in fact, even among American Jews, only about 4% put Israel as the number one or number two issue of Jews' vote. So what I'm saying is all of
And I guess this is what's
the institutional
this is
power.
what's so perplexing about it. On the one hand, there is this indifference, which you've written about actually very lyrically and beautifully, the indifference towards Palestinians. But on the other hand, it's a must-take position, right? So on the one hand, that no one cares, but on the other hand, people care so much that it's political suicide to take a moral and just position rather than just succumb to AIPAC.
And I could say the exact same thing about gun control, right? 90% of Americans support gun control. We don't get any gun control. Why? Because the people who care most about it, who care about nothing but keeping their guns, are the people who are most involved. They are the people who are going to make life miserable if a congressman votes the wrong way on gun control. AIPAC and the NRA have a great deal in common. I mean, they're both really good at manipulating the American political process. So with intensity, the anti-abortion people are also quite good at this. Their intensity trumps the numbers on the other side. And actually the American Constitution was in part set up so this could work. That's why we have the filibuster, among other things. So actually that's not part of the Constitution, but it's why we have the filibuster. So America is not intended to be a democracy. And of course money is obviously an enormous problem in American politics. But the intensity, and I have to say that the genius of AIPAC and the President's Conference and the ADL and the AJC of their organizational abilities. And I have to say the sort of the lack of seriousness on the Palestinian side about power. They win the rhetorical arguments and lose the votes all the time. Well, not all the time, but lately. I hate to quote this cliche of Allah Ebn, but it's true. The Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. There were many opportunities beginning, I would say, in 1921, where they could have built on a foundation of statehood and achievements, and they didn't because they would not compromise. They would not compromise with the UN in 1947. They would not compromise. They refused. Edward Said, I used to be friends with Edward Said. He told me that Cyrus Vance sent him to Beirut during Camp David and said to tell Arafat, we will recognize the PLO if you come to Camp David and negotiate with the state of Israel. And I'll force Israel to negotiate. And Arafat would not even see him. Now, there could be, I think, we're not going to get into this. I think, yeah.
That's a.
But I'm just
I mean,
saying.
you are speaking to Israeli leftists here, not all of us, but some of us, and
Okay.
that's not how we speak about Palestinians in the sense of missed opportunity, that they've missed every opportunity. That's, it's on the ground.
I said no one is
You
going to
don't
completely
see
like my book.
Different.
Everyone's going to have objections to my book one way or another. But yeah, because I'm very critical. I'm obviously critical of Israeli behavior. I'm critical of American Jew supporters of Israel. But I'm also critical of the way Palestinians have handled the problems that they have been facing. And that's why I'm so much fun to be around.
Absolutely. Okay, one last question, and then I will open the floor to this audience. You're also a media critic, and have been for a long time. I've seen American media undergo several important transformations. And in May 2021, when the current or the last round of warfare between Israel and Palestinians was raging, it seemed like it was a watershed moment in American coverage of the conflict. And the front page of the New York Times was the daily miseries of living under Israeli occupation. That's not the kind of language that I remember, and I too read the New York Times every day in the same way that you read Haaretz. That's not the kind of language that I seem to remember as characterizing Times coverage. Now, you're also a great critic of the New York Times, but there seemed to be a moment of reckoning, and there seemed to be a real shift. Is that actually true in hindsight, looking back a year later? Did that hold, or did the tone of the pro-Israel Palestinians, the indifference, more than anything else, the indifference, what we saw in May 2021, by my assessment, was finally a crack in the wall of indifference towards Palestinian suffering? And I'm wondering whether you thought so too, and how do you think about this question 1 year later?
Thank you. I could give a lecture on this question. First of all, I agree there was something profound about the way that war was covered in both the Times and the Washington Post, actually. I could show you articles. It was quite similar. There was an amazing video made by the New York Times about what was it like to live under occupation. When the New York Times put pictures of 69 children who were killed in Gaza on the front page, it was an incredible shock to the system of America. The New York Times is kind of like, it's the American Jewish hometown paper. There's a character in a play that was in the public theater recently. The woman was played, I think, by Bette Midler. And she says, when they ask me my religion, I don't put down Jewish, I put down the New York Times. And for the New York Times to be as critical as it was in that war was a shock. And Abe Foxman said that he was canceling his subscription to the New York Times after 60 years because it was so, he used the word anti-Semitic to put the pictures of killed dead children on the front page. On the one hand. On the other hand, its audience is mainstream American, mainstream Americans. A significant percentage are Jewish. I wouldn't be surprised if it were a majority. Well, not a majority online, but subscribing. In fact, this woman character mocks people who only subscribe online. That's not real, not really members of the tribe. But I could argue this either way. I think I helped get the New York Times to finally mention the Amnesty International report after 55 days of not mentioning it and giving me a reason why they didn't think it was important. They eventually changed their minds. The Times, what I left on Saturday night, the Times still had not mentioned the court's decision to allow the expulsion of 1,000 people from Masafayat. So, see, someone wrote today, it's a great quote, the slogan of the New York Times should be, it's not news until we say it's news. And they're very good, actually, when they decide it's news. Now, there's a great book by a media historian named Herbert Gans called Deciding What's News. And that's really where the power of the media lay. Media, plural word. So yes, I think that Israel always expected the American media to treat Israel the way that the Israelis saw themselves. It didn't. New York Times was always far more sympathetic to Israel than The Guardian was, than Le Monde was, and then Haaretz. And that is changing slowly over time. Does it affect the power relations I described earlier so that it will actually in any way? Again, on the one hand, the Palestinian people all over the world, in Israel, in the West Bank, in exile, can take great comfort in the advances that they've made in public opinion, in the public discourse, with the thing that I pay most attention to. But how that translates into improving the lives of the generations of Palestinians who are born into refugee camps. I've been inside a refugee camp. It's the worst place I've ever been in my life. Who can look forward to their children and their grandchildren growing up in the same place. I don't see it. I see a disconnect. And that's what I'm trying to communicate. That to the people who care about this issue, who care about Israel remaining or becoming democratic. I mean, there's a real issue there. To the people who care about the Israel that they grew up believing in, there's a real disconnect between the discourse and actually doing something about it. And after writing about it for 40 years, but intensely for 7 years, I have lost patience with people who only care about winning the rhetorical fight and not caring about the conditions of the lives of the people who live.
I think that's awfully
Quite frustrating for Israeli activists as well. All right, I think this is a good moment to open it up to questions. So please feel free. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Alterman. My study deals with Jewish American political conservatism in Israel, and Israel in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I've learned, which surprised me, is that for the last almost 100 years, the pressure that sentence, Charles Liebman called that in his book about pressure and sentence from American Jews in Israel, always came from Orthodox Jews, never from the liberal community. And he explains that by stating that the Orthodox and later on conservative, political conservative Jews, secular or religious, was that they had a vision for Israel. That the liberal community, the liberal Jewish American community, never really had. And so if you don't have a vision for Israel, you don't put pressure, sanctions, and then put aside for a second the pro-Palestinian and what others would consider, anti-Israeli, Jewish left activity in America, and put aside AIPAC doing what it's doing for the last 40 years, protecting the official pro-Israel stance without giving groups like JST an opportunity, or the Jewish American intellectuals, whatnot, to build a liberal vision for Israel. Now that you are entitled for the pressure, and the Ben Gurion and Bernstein understanding doesn't hold anymore. You have the right, and the conservative Jewish American movement has done so much in Israel for the last 20 years, because they have that vision, conservative vision in Israel. So what do you think? Do you think it just was lost in time, or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is taking most of the agenda of Jewish American life?
Thank you. Let me just repeat the questions for those at home who did not hear it without a microphone. The question is about a liberal vision for Israel and the lack thereof on the American left, and the ways in which that has left the space, right, for a conservative American vision to dominate work here on the ground.
I think it's a shame people at home couldn't hear you because I think what you said is more eloquently than I can answer it. I think up until a certain point, around 82, between 82 and 88, I would say, American Jews were comfortable with their liberalism and their Zionism. And since around somewhere at that point, Israel has forced them to choose. In part because the occupation seems forever, and therefore Israel has to choose between being a Jewish state and being a democracy. And conservatives are comfortable choosing a Jewish state. American Jews are not. First of all, it contradicts their liberal politics, which have remained remarkably stable. I mean, one of the great stories that I haven't done justice to is the remarkable stability of American Jewish liberalism. It's the only white American group that can be dependent upon to vote Democratic, period. And not just vote, but fight, but, stick to the argument. And the whole idea of a Jewish state, an ethnographic state, has come under questioning. In colleges it's questioned explicitly, but among American liberals it's become uncomfortable. Like, what is the reason that that people living next to each other have such different rights? How do you explain it if the occupation is not going anywhere? I'm not going to tell you the statistics of like water rights versus settlements versus the Palestinians, and et cetera. Go on forever. But there's no Israel's. The answers that Israel has always given, either that this occupation is temporary, or that the Arabs are trying to destroy us, and it's really none of your business. If you want to have a voice in this, come over and live here. Otherwise, shut up and just sign a check. Those answers, the response to that has become, all right, I'm going to worry about something else. And actually, that's the answer I'm giving in my book. I'm sorry, I'm abandoning you and your colleagues. I'm saying I'm going to devote my attention to trying to rejuvenate, to rebuilding American Judaism, because I think it's been hollowed out. And those are my people. I used to have in my will Israeli peace groups. I'm changing my will, and
Serious?
I am. And I'm funding American Jewish scholarly and charitable institutions, with one exception. I love the organization Truah, that used to be called Rabbis for Human Rights. They're still in there, but I feel like it's not. I feel like Israel has said to American Jews, we're going our own way, and you can take it or leave it. And more American Jews and American liberals are just going to leave it. They're not going to have this fight because it's no longer central to their identity the way it was for the generations who had grandparents who lived through the Holocaust, who had grandparents and parents who saw the creation of the state and the heroic age of the state, and who could watch Exodus and believe it. That's the path. And so now there's a sense of hopelessness. And again, if the choice is between, Peter Barnard has said this better than I can. If the choice is between American Jews' liberalism and Zionism, they're going to choose their liberalism because, number one, Zionism is very problematic in the way it's being enacted. And number two, liberalism is where they live. That's who they are.
I will say that there are a lot of day-to-day heroic acts by groups fighting the occupation and fighting for just and lasting peace.
Oh, I don't deny that, and I
That's
greatly admire.
not, it doesn't. It's not as easy to digest and represent as Exodus, but it's important and unglorified work.
I have the greatest admiration for it, particularly given how much harder it's gotten over the years. I just think it's an Israeli fight rather than an American Jewish fight.
That is completely fair. All right, next, go ahead.
Thanks for a great talk. I still can't quite tell whether you think the Israelis, not the Israeli left, but the 80% of Israelis who admire Trump, Zionists perhaps more broadly, should care about losing the American Jews, the American college campus, where Edward Said's book is iconic, a precursor to Intersectionality, which is a key aspect of wokeness. What's the Zionist equivalent to Said's book on American campuses? There isn't one.
No.
What?
Dershowitz, the
What?
case for Israel, right?
Why is the campus in America so homogeneous? It can't be because that they're reading Orientalism. It's unreadable. I'm gonna.
Yeah, no, it's hard to read.
And yet it's iconic.
Even Kimberly Crenshaw is hard to read.
Right. So it's symbolic of a mood on campuses, and it's fairly homogeneous. If I'm understanding your take on it, from what I've seen, do normal Israelis need to care? Will the bipartisan support continue? And how can a complex conflict, wherever you stand on it, everyone in this room knows it, would be perhaps a bit reluctant and complicated, but on American campuses, it's not complicated. How can this be? It doesn't matter to Israelis.
Okay, once again, to really summarize briefly, the question is, how have American campuses become so homogenous in their I can't bring myself to call it anti-Israel, so I will call it anti-Israeli government policies over the years. And where is the Zionist answer to Said? Where's the seminal text, right, that will provide the ammunition, so to speak, that pro-Zionist or that pro-Israeli government policies over the years require?
First of all, I should clarify what I was trying to say. It's not American campuses. It's very elite American campuses. Maybe 20 or 30, or maybe 50 tops that actually anybody cares. Otherwise, one of the great ironies of American, the coverage of American education is that it's all focused on these elite colleges that journalists, including myself, went to. And the vast majority of American students go to colleges like the one I teach at. And nobody cares. And Israelis won't understand this reference probably, but I'm saying it for the people who are watching from America. Amy Chewitt's dinner parties at Yale have gotten more coverage than the entire public education system at a higher level in America, and that's not an exaggeration. So it's elite. It's elite students who, like me when I was young, get their identity from joining the heroic revolutionary movements to some degree, one or another. Central America, Vietnam, anti-nuclear, and Israel has lost that battle, in part for the reasons I gave. It's not really because of Orientalism. Orientalism was a useful artifact to, just like Kimberly Crenshaw's essay on intersectionality. Nobody reads them anymore. But they hold them up. It's actually, Nation magazine, we used to say, bad for the country, good for the nation. Because whenever we go to war, everybody would subscribe to the Nation, because they did it as an act of solidarity. So they didn't have to read it, and we didn't care, because it was good for business. So I would say that it's primarily an elite phenomenon. It's not true at most public universities, which is where most students go. Most students don't care even at elite universities. I mean, the Harvard Crimson editors are not representative of Harvard University, much less American students, generally speaking. But they are representative of who's going to be Secretary of State 20 years, 30 years from now. So if I were an Israeli worried about the future of Zionism, first of all, I would try to have a better Zionism. But second of all, that's where my concern would be. That with the fact that young people are watching, they're watching mourners for American journalists being beaten with sticks, and they're drawing their conclusions from that, and then they're being given a foundation of understanding, which is the idea of settler colonialism, which is largely unchallenged. The Israelis are terrible at challenging it. The woman that they picked as an anti-Semitism woman says, well, every country kills journalists. What's the big deal? Really, that's what she's saying. I'm not kidding. And the Israeli government, the funding, the anti-BDS funding, they gave half of it to the guy who used to run Christians United for Israel. They're giving the money to right-wing Christians to fight BDS, in addition to some other problematic things that they do. So I would say that battle is lost, and you don't really have to care unless you want to hear your relatives or your friends complain about their children. But but something is happening that 20 or 30 years from now will have some meaning. Now, the problem with my saying that is, who knows what will happen 20 years or 30 years from now. 9/11 changed everything to some degree, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed a lot of things, and we don't know what's going to happen. But to the degree that one cares about it, that's where the concern is. This training of the American elite establishment is being fundamentally different than when I went to college, a long time ago.
All right, we are going over time, but I will allow one more question if people are up for it. Go ahead.
How does political polarization in the U.S. affect how politicians look at Israel? Isn't that all has to do with political weapons, one side or the other? The more they're polarized, the more it's easy, the more it's useful to use this political weapon. Use Israel as a political weapon against, and what Rashida Tlaib is doing now. Isn't it credit for her to her base in the upcoming midterm elections? Isn't that useful for her to use this Nakba recognition of the Nakba in Congress in order for her to get more support?
Let me just repeat that. The question is political polarization in America and how Israel figures as a weapon within it.
I'm not going to speak to that particular example. It's a unique example because of the nature of that particular district, which is many Palestinians in it. But to the question of how does political polarization affect the debate over Israel, well, one way it affects it is that the country is very clearly divided between districts that only a Democrat can win and only a Republican can win. So we have a new Democrat. I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. They just created a new. I could live in Brooklyn. I could live in Park Slope. I teach at Brooklyn College. I could live in Park Slope. So they've just created a new district which combines the East Side with the West Side. So the two Democrats, Jerry Nadler and Carolyn Maloney, both of whom, by the way, are over 80, are going to have to run against each other. And whoever wins the primary, there will be no general election. It doesn't matter who the Republicans put up. In my district, but my neighborhood went 90% for Biden. 90%. Actually, I think, anyway, over 90%. 90% would be relatively weak. So, and then, that's true in the opposite direction in a lot of places. One reason we're not a democracy is because there are people in Alaska and Wyoming have 2 senators, and I have 2 senators, and I have 8 million people, and they have like 25. But the fact is that the polarization has defined these lines much more sharply than in the past. So there's very few competitive districts left anymore, and so now you just choose which side you're going to get your money from. And that's what I mean by the institutional arrangements favoring what's referred to as the pro-Israel side. I mean, I would say that. I mean, I always put pro-Israel in quotes because I think to be pro-Israel is to support some sort of solution that will allow the Israelis and the Palestinians to live in peace and dignity.
A just and lasting solution.
Yes, and that's what it means to be pro-Israel, and that's why I hate the way the word pro-Israel is used in the United States. But the fact is that they have colonized that word. They have occupied that word. And as I said, if you want a lot of trouble over something that is probably not important to very many of your districts, many people in your district, then oppose Israel. I think I'm actually surprised. I think the Nakba, well, no, it's only got about 5 supporters, the Nakba Day resolution. I was surprised that 30 congressmen were willing to sign on to asking Israel, demanding that Israel investigate the death of the Palestinian American journalist. That seemed like an awfully high number. The fact that Bernie Sanders is considered a legitimate leader within the Democratic Party, and he has chosen to take this path, has made it possible for more people to speak out and feel that they're relatively safe. But I'll bet if you looked at those 30 people who were asking just for an investigation of the shooting of an American citizen, then they're all from safety. They're all from safety.
So we're pretty much back where we started, right? No one cares, but on the other hand, people care too much.
Yep.
All right.
Well said. That's what I should have called my book.
All right, everyone. Please join me in thanking Professor Alterman. Thank you all for coming, and thanks everyone at home for joining us.